Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sarah Leclerc, taku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Madam Chair, Deputy Chair and Councillors, so I'm here today to introduce our strategic approach to sediment paper and acknowledging and thanking the input, both the public input and also from Kipakura Green and also the Manukau Harbour Forum, and I hope to be able to address some of the issues that they raised there later in the presentation. But first of all, I will just start with a bit of a broad approach and then focus on one of the specific work areas where we have made significant progress, which I hope you'll acknowledge and be pleased with, and then take any questions. So essentially, here we go. Just very basically, what is sediment? When viewed as a contaminant, it's mud in the wrong place, quite simply. It's the most visible contaminant to enter our waterways, but its effects can be devastating, both on our ecosystems and also on our communities. It's clearly an ongoing concern for all our harbours, and it's a highly emotive issue, as demonstrated by the response of communities across the region and the response from our local boards. But it's a complex issue. There are multiple sources of sediment, and it's often very, very difficult to distinguish one from another within the same catchment. Sediment and sedimentation are also a natural part of the evolution of our freshwater and coastal ecosystems, and this is particularly the case in Auckland's, with Auckland's topography and its soil type. And loads are made worse through changes in land use, both in our rural and our urban environments. We can, and we do, put measures in place to reduce the amount of sediment being delivered to waterways beyond these natural processes, but it's clear from what we see and what we hear, we need to do better and we need to do more. This programme is about how we can do better and how we can do more. Firstly, with the tools and resources at our disposal, by working more collaboratively, both across council and with wider stakeholders and partners, and then what else we need to do to make a step change to improve environmental outcomes in relation to sediment for Auckland. So this slide, sort of quite a busy slide, really is just to highlight that the programme recognises the wide range of strategic research, monitoring, enforcement and mitigation initiatives that address the challenges and opportunities for improving sediment outcomes across the council. Alongside this, community concerns raised through the various harbour fora, and we've heard more about that earlier today. There's no easy fix, because sometimes it takes many years for the pollution already in our land and water to dissipate. And these issues started right back with major land use changes at the beginning of the last century. So we're looking at a historic issue that we're trying to resolve. And in the background, we have a strong push from central government via the Essential Fresh Water Programme, which will have a major influence on how we as a council approach water quality in general and also sediment in particular. The focus of this programme is to close that policy effectiveness loop so that we take local examples and experiences to inform on strategic regional approaches, which will be based on evidence and embedded in policy and process so that it becomes part of our business as usual. And then it delivers solutions at a regional scale that are independent of staff turnovers and restructures, so, and for improving our environmental outcomes. So the next two slides just highlight the work programme. I hadn't anticipated going into those in detail, but pleased to answer questions on those as they arise. Have I got control now? Oh, no. So the programme is being set out, as we had already heard, in 6 work areas. Firstly, around better information, looking at strategy and policy, looking at interventions, and then monitoring, evaluation, coordinating and building capacity, and communication and engagement. Each of those have clear objectives and clear outputs, and the idea is that they will come together in a work programme which is an inclusive policy framework that will see enduring solutions. So the attachment here, the report itself provides a small amount of detail on each of those work areas, and the attachment provides an explicit reference to each of the work outputs and how we'll draw those together. Just briefly, one of the things I'd like to highlight today is one of the quick wins to date around small sites compliance. We've heard a bit around small sites from the Manukau Harbour Forum and the excellent work they have already been doing on this issue with their Small Sites Ambassador programme with Healthy Waters and formerly Environmental Services. One example of where this strategic approach is showing its value relates to compliance in this area. The lack of erosion and sediment controls on small sites is a long-standing issue. Council has been grappling with this for decades. Regional and central government pressure for increased and faster development means that this issue is only going to increase over the next decade. Acknowledging the work of, that was done in Flatbush by the Targeted Initiatives team, following on from the Small Sites Ambassador Programme, I think it's just really to highlight the extent of the issue. And it really is essential that we look at the cumulative impacts of these and try and improve how we manage this on site and how we improve what are really quite shocking practices on our small sites across Auckland. So I think we all agree we need a change in approach. We've traditionally, compliance has been seen as that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. We can either try and hoist the ambulance up or try and put some fencing at that top of that cliff to try and improve the way in which we manage sediment on those small sites. So sustained education and training within the building industry is costly to achieve at the scale that we require to impact the whole region. Targeted initiatives clearly show that, that it has limited success in achieving compliance in the absence of any sustained quality inspection and enforcement. And what's clear from that programme is no single department can achieve the level and scale of compliance required to make a difference to environmental outcomes. So we've been looking at a step change to achieve compliance in these small sites and using the collective resources of council in a more collaborative manner. There are long-term policy options that need to be examined as part of the longer-term solution, but there are actions that we can take now and we have put in place now to try and achieve this. What we have put in place is working with target initiatives, is involving building inspectors through enhanced training. Adrian Wilson tomorrow, he's the head of the targeted initiatives team who's been looking at small sites. He's going to see the Master Builders Association arranged through the building inspectors. Now, as part of their every initial training and every ongoing training for every building inspector will have enhanced training around erosion and sediment control. They will now, we have building inspectors visit sites 15 to 18 times during the course of a build. They will, every time they now visit, they will be reporting back to Targeted Initiatives team, compliance team on the existence or not of erosion sediment controls. That will then trigger a response from that team. So the existence of that team now has made that possible to happen. And what was very clear that any proposals to include the building inspectors in this process should be integrated within their existing training programmes, be fully supported by compliance and not add undue burden to an already stretched inspection schedule. So the way in which we've done it, we're going to include it within their new tablet system. So it'll take approximately 30 seconds additional of their time each time they visit a site. So we now have eyes and ears of the council on those about 15,000, 20,000 sites across Auckland every single time. With further ways to go, we want to bridge that gap between bulk earthworks and small sites, and we are now looking at ways in which we do that and what the both policy, legal and resource implications for that are, and we'll be coming back to council with suggestions on how we make that possible. And so we're looking at self-certification of erosion and sediment controls, and we're also looking at how we can work better with the industry through such things as the Small Sites Ambassador Project, but also directly with industry associations, master builder associations, to try and improve building best practice and try and encourage those who are traditionally seen as part of the problem to become part of the solution and reward them for doing so. So that comes to the end of my presentation. We just hope that you can see this, we're through the strategic approach, we aim to close that policy loop in a number of areas to deliver positive outcomes for sediment across the whole region.
Fantastic, thank you, Sarah. Right, Councillor Walker.
Sure, got a couple of questions. First off, across the approach that you're taking around all of these areas, is it possible to have a rolling review so that we can get some quicker wins in some areas rather than a situation where we might be waiting some time for a big bundled up report?
We can come back as we have things to report. I'm more than happy to do that. I think it's important. We have things in train, especially around the small site stuff that we could happily report on. And then as we discover anything else, I'm sure that's possible.
And just a further question, I mean, the small site stuff is great. It's actually fairly unpleasant what's occurring, and I think Aucklanders need to be aware of the amount of sedimentation that's coming off the small sites, but as compared to the large sites, and many of them have got a lot of visibility, is it conceivable that we can get some quick wins there?
It's certainly something we are looking at as part of the programme. The reason for the focus on the small sites was to really build on the momentum of an existing programme and recognise that we could get some really quick wins in that area. So that was why we had that initial focus, whilst targeted initiatives were specifically targeting that. But we have in the background also been doing work on the larger sites and recognise that the bulk earthworks, the consented earthworks is also a large part of the issue, and we have been doing some background work on that as well already, and we hope to be able to bring more of that to the committee as we work out solutions for that.
And just around the large sites, is it conceivable that we might need some more budget there around monitoring and enforcement, depending on how much we're lifting the bar?
That's something which we would I wouldn't like to say now, because our real focus has been trying to do what we do better with existing budgets. But if there is a requirement for more budget, then it's something we would come back to committee with.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Philippaina.
Thank you, Chair. And Sarah, to you, Laurel, and to Dave, just to reinforce what the Chair said around the work to get us to this point. My question is, am I correct in that this is a regional approach first? We need to get that regional context there first, and then from there work on some of the areas that we have, whether it be Manukau, whether it be Okura, Waiti. That's when we can end up getting in regards to the details for that. But this is a regional approach?
Yes, very much so. We are using specific local examples where relevant, but trying to look at, and we're trying to achieve changes at scale at a regional level, and then where there are specific smaller either catchment or watershed approaches required that are slightly different, then we would look to refine that down. But we want to try and get that regional approach, the strategic approach, in place first, so that we can then, within that framework, deliver effective results in other areas too.
Thank you. And Chair, I just reserve my right to speak, and it'll be just very quickly. Thank you.
Absolutely fine. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Watson.
Oh, no, just want to make a few quick comments when you're ready, Madam Chair.
Cool. Councillor Newman.
Just wondering if we're looking at this from the wrong perspective. Really, is this actually an issue to do with planning and what we provide for as a restricted discretionary activity around bulk earthworks in the Unitary Plan, that we can talk about and resource inspectors, and they can go and do monitoring, report on what they see, maybe issue abatement notices, but fundamentally, if the activity is a restricted discretionary activity that is permitted, it is probably with the Unitary Plan that we need to start.
We are looking also at the Unitary Plan. We are looking at the evolution of the plan. We are looking at, we've got 3 different studies looking at the Unitary Plan and its effectiveness. We've been looking at how it evolved from the district plans through the independent hearings panel through to what we currently have. What became, and that will happen through the National Policy Statement on fresh water and how we implement that. What became evident through that evolution, although while there are specific issues with the implementation of that in some places, for example, around the permitted activity for small sites, there are no controls going in the first place. So irrespective of what rules we have in place, there's nothing actually happening on the ground. So there is a compliance issue and there's a policy issue. But from a sediment perspective, it's not only development control and a Unitary Plan issue, there are also non-regulatory mechanisms that we also need to be putting in place in the rural environment. It's not just the urban environment. So whilst this is what we focused on at the moment to start with, we have areas of work which are continuing in the background for example, in the Kaipara, looking at the whole range of issues affecting sediment across the region.
Perhaps I can quickly add to that. If you look at the work areas, we start to identify some of those major pieces of work and what are the levers that we've got at our disposal. So that might be a policy, consenting, monitoring, enforcement kind of angle. So it covers across a whole range of different activities. And the intent of this program over the next while is to sort of really scope that out in a proper way, thorough way, integrated way, so we know where the best bang for buck will be. So by the time we're available to come back to you in about June next year, we'll be able to say this is where we should really be focusing our efforts. So I think that's what we would like to do.
Reserve my right to say a few things later, Chair.
Okay. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really wanted to ask about, if you look at the program context 2018, and we've got Manukau Harbour Forum, but we've heard in here, but not so much the hydrodynamic modelling, which of course talks about the flows, where all that sediment goes. Given the Manukau Harbour Forum's presentation earlier, our water strategy, our sedimentation stuff, these reports here, is there some way we can pull that in together? We've spent, I think we've put $1 million into the hydrodynamic modelling in Manukau in 2015 LTP. Is that important work to be able to pull this in and help elevate the work they're doing there? Because that's critical. We heard that a third or 30%-ish of our building consents are flowing into that catchment. I mean, it's all important too, but is there some way of helping them get some more momentum in the work there, pulling it in with this work?
Through the Chair, perhaps I can answer that. So the work that's being done by Watercare around the hydrodynamic model in Manukau is around nutrient delivery, but Healthy Waters and Auckland Council are going to do sediment modelling in the Manukau, pulling together all the work for the National Policy Statement, looking at what's happening in the freshwater, what's coming off the land, and then delivering some outcomes around what we can expect in the coastal environment. So we can pull something together.
So they'll pull in the Manukau Harbour Forum work as well?
Absolutely.
Just as we've got, the work we're doing on Kaipara, we've got a group there.
Yep.
Okay, and you've got the Waitemata Forum. Okay, that's really good, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions? We'll go to, you've got the recommendations in front of you, and just acknowledging Councillor Walker and Councillor Watson, the two recommendations in red, fine, so I've just added them to the list of recommendations, and I think Councillor Filipaini, you were going to move
If that's okay.
those.
Second.
And I think Councillor Walker, you'd like to second some, and we'll go to speaking.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So they've been moved and seconded. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, Chair, I think this is, I think we can try and resource up and to provide training for on-site work in the field from inspectors, try and give guidance. I think that the difficulty here is ultimately it comes down to a debate about what is a permitted activity, what's a discretionary activity, those things that are consented. Once they're consented, and then people start to push the margins of what's being consented, and how you try and enforce those practices that are happening, whether consented or not consented, is the issue here. But it comes back to what did the planning document say that allowed the activity to take place in the first place, and that to me is the nub of this. Having in a past life provided technical evidence to the independent hearings panel on the proposed Auckland Unitary Plan at the time, I think that the changes that relate to development controls were not helpful, and it's too permissive in this space in the Unitary Plan, I have to say, and that if there is an opportunity in the future, Chair, some of the parts of the Unitary Plan are going to have to be rewritten, including those that relate to controls as it applies to bulk earthworks, because I think there are some environments where work is taking place where it shouldn't, I know that the premise of the RMA is around managing effects, but I actually think that there are some effects that are not well managed and probably can't be managed in the context of the receiving environment where some of the sediment goes. So I applaud the work that is taking place here, but I think that there is a conversation that will need to take place more in a planning context than in terms of an operational response to some of the practices that are occurring that are undermining the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Newman, and totally agreeing, and that's why this is a joint piece of work between the Environment Committee, the Planning Committee and the Regulatory Committee, because hopefully the changes that may be required through the Unitary Plan are critical to this, so the Regulatory Committee can then empower our staff to enforce them. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few quick comments. I'm more than happy to support this approach to sediment. It is a good report. It spells out clearly the challenge to Auckland in terms of sedimentation. Over 300,000 dwellings in the next 30 years, and an increase in our urban footprint by nearly 20%. That's a considerable increase. But I think more than that, what I like is the comments that the approach to sediment control requires a step change, and I think that is what our committee has acknowledged, and thank you for our members of the community who have helped in moving that acknowledgement along. We need to move away from the notion that environmental degradation is almost an inevitable consequence of development, and I think, to be honest, up until this point we've been consumed with housing and development, and the environment has come a very poor second. I think Councillor Newman made some very salutary points here in terms of the Unitary Plan. So it is very good to see that sort of acknowledgement there in black and white, as indeed is reflected in the work areas too, and not so much the work areas for me, but the actual outcomes, because it's actions I'm interested in, things that actually result, and things that result in a reasonably expeditious manner. And the three that stood out for me were the reversal of environmental decline, the prevention of sediment runoff, and encouraging those who contribute to become part of the solutions, rather than just putting your hands up and saying, well, it's not me, it's something else. So those outcomes, if they were to happen, then I think will go a long way to solving that problem. And it is nice to know that we do have some working examples where things are actually happening now, or have been happening, that we can just look to emulate and roll out across the area. We heard from Kipo Kura-Groon the situation in Scott Point, and this can go right across the region where we have these adaptive management plans that are based on thresholds and triggers and have been successful. But again, we want to involve and incentivise all, not just have the good guy that's doing it be saying, well, look, geez, I'm the only one that's doing the right thing here, and the other blighters across the road are getting away with dumping heaps of sediment into the environment. So I think we need to raise this bar for new consents, and perhaps make people that are on existing consents think, well, actually, I am subpar now, and there are numbers of big developments around, particularly in sensitive environments, that are subpar. So rather than them perhaps telling us that they're up with the play or they're meeting their obligations, we say, well, no, actually, that's what's really required now. How about coming up to that? And again, if we have this sort of buy-in, this notion that everyone's owning the problem, then I think that will be easier to manage, and I think that also comes through in the report. Finally, Madam Chair, I would just like to commend the work program and the fact that there does seem to be a bit of impetus here. It's not just into the far nebulous distant future where things may or may not happen. We have a timeline for June 2019 to implement change. If we can bring other improvements on in that interim, which I see no reason why we can't, then all the better. But thank you to our staff who've been involved in this, and particularly thank you to our community groups who have such a passion for this, who are driven by none other than to see the right outcome, and who are a real asset to us. So onwards and upwards, and let's get some action coming out of all this.
Awesome. Thanks, Councillor Watson. Councillor Walker.
Sure. Happy to speak to this. Just following on from Councillor Watson and Councillor Newman, I'd like to commend the officers, particularly Sarah, for leading this initiative. It's really good stuff. It's an integrated approach that runs across council, and like the water approach, increasingly, that is what we need. I'd also like to convey the urgency of this and the priority of it, certainly on my part, and I would suggest the majority of councillors, if not all of them, and the people of Auckland. And that also includes not just people, but the environment, because frankly, that is what is suffering. Just a few comments, and one I'm sure that my fellow councillor Mike Lee would raise is around the link to the health of the Hauraki Gulf and the Marine Park, because that is a very important piece of legislation, and making sure that in the process that you're engaged with here, given a rolling approach, that you keep that forum up to date, because it has a strong part to play. I would note, and I would encourage you, that if there are budgetary implications, that you bring those to us, and ideally earlier rather than later, because the annual plan process is underway. It may be that we can get some money from the targeted rate that we've got on the environment, but we may need a little more, and I'm sure as far as Aucklanders are concerned, if it needs a little more, they'd be happy to pay, and I'm sure if Linda Cooper, with her regulatory hat on, has got a bit more money to play with, she'd be very happy with that. So this is really good. I'd just like to emphasise the limits-based approach that could be given some consideration, and we know that's being used elsewhere and by other councils I would add. So if we can give some priority around that, then that would be marvellous. So happy to second this, Madam Chair. It's a good piece of work.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Philip. Councillor Philippine, I'll wait till the end, because if you speak, you'll close the debate. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really commend this report, because it has responded to an issue. Initially, we talked about it in one very sensitive area, but it is a regional issue, given that we've got 420 spots for 420,000 homes that need to be built in the next couple of decades. And I think the second to last slide on our presentation sums it all up. We need a change in approach. The fence at the top of the cliff instead of the bottom. And I guess that's with my regulatory hat. I'll speak, and I do support D there, because the reality is we do need money, but we also, even if we have a full complement of officers trained up superbly, and that's why our regulatory staff are on another training day today, is that we can enforce as much as we like, but if the rules aren't right, we're still not going to make an effect, or an adequate effect. So I think that if we can look at the rules and put that fence at the top of the cliff, that will make a huge difference. And then our staff can do their job well, but they'll have the right rules, and we'll be enforcing properly. We'll actually be enforcing rules that maybe aren't quite as tight as we need them now, but at the same time we need to balance. As I said, we've got 420,000 homes enabled in the Unitary Plan, and we've got huge pressure from the government as well, saying we haven't done our bit, but we've enabled that many houses or homes. We've got employment land we have to develop, because we've got to have jobs for people. So we've somehow got to find a happy medium that protects our environment, at the same time provides what we need for people to live and work. But the other thing, which is an open-ended comment, is around what happens with proposed UDA. you know, will that undermine our efforts? And I'm quite concerned about that. Thank you,
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Very important to raise that. Thank you, councillor. Member Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just really want to carry on around the compliance matters. So I'm really happy to hear that there's extra resourcing and investment going into training or further training of inspectors. But I also consider too, it's a bit like, say, freshwater management and carrying the dairy farmers along with you, because if you don't, you'll never get there. So are we also carrying industry as well? And because, you know, I know a number of people that dislike irresponsible developers, and those are responsible developers. So I don't think people get out of bed in the morning to go and wreck the environment.
No.
So I think the training's not just unique to compliance in-house. It's also a continuum to the industry itself. So I'm wondering if, and I'm assuming there's energy going external into the sector of the same. And I was also thinking about HUDA or UDA around having these strategies and these rules and the like, and then the kehua turns up with a new show. So I'm not sure how that's captured in the conditioning sense, but in reality, if regardless of where we are today of progress, and regardless of what plan, my understanding is every application that has an approval also has the appropriate conditions. And when I'm talking compliance, that's what I'm talking about, is around the approval conditions that permit the activity in the first place. Now, although it's permitted, it's still controlled and managed. So I have seen, quite sadly, a recent example where I did discover that being a building inspector is not necessarily a site inspector. And I was concerned, so I'm happy to learn today that you guys have got some scrutiny over it, because what I did observe is the euphoria of volume and speed versus what was actually under the eyesight of the inspector on site at that time. He was focused on the constructive side of things and was completely oblivious to erosion controls that weren't working, and actually didn't really turn up for that anyway.
Okay.
I can speak to that very specific point if that's relevant.
Yep.
With the new system that building inspectors will now be using, they will have to photograph and report on erosion and sediment controls at every site visit. So there will be a change in mindset into approaching erosion and sediment control on those sites as part of their, and it will be a compulsory tick box they have to fill in order to be able to complete their inspection.
I think you're not going to use Flatbush again, because I was immersed in the Flatbush structure plan when it went through in the late 90s. And then to learn today and known for some time that actually when you get to practice it doesn't really work like that. Well, it doesn't on the low scale little guys, but my confidence is it still does around responsible people, regardless of what they're doing. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that there is some energy going into the site side as much as to the constructive side.
Good point. Thank you. Councillor Darby.
Thanks. Look, probably mainly to acknowledge the work that Dave and the team have been doing here, and this was a key alarm that was signalled through sea change. So it seems a long way back that work was undertaken, and here we are now. And probably I just really want to stress that we're not just talking about sediment here that is discharged from greenfield developments or erosion or anything like that, but as I've stressed in our workshops, we are discharging massive amounts of sediment from the built urban environment, the street network, and this has to be addressed with our CCO Auckland Transport as well. We are still continuing to make impermeable surfaces that generate more sediment. That is today's practice, so we are still doing it. We're still doing it, and we're still creating a problem as of today. I'm quite concerned, Madam Chair, about our Auckland Transport. I understand it's being handed to Healthy Waters, but no sign of improvement. Our culvert extraction program, our curb sweeping program, it's not properly being monitored. It's almost a complete failure at the moment. So while we are putting these strategies in place, we've got some systemic failures within our system. And the report and the direction picks up a lot of that. But I'm aware in the city centre, we have had blocked culverts, cesspits, blocked, not receiving any water because they are choked with waste, sediment waste from the city environment, and they have been that way for 6 months and 12 months. I know particular corridors that have never been swept because I see the same lump of 4x2 in the gutter. So there's some real fundamental disconnects here. And if there's any evidence, as I've said in this meeting 6 months ago, and it's still the same, when we walk from our Albert Street office and we cross at the Albert Street Wellesley intersection, look down on your left and look at the debris in the gutter that has been there for 6 months. And we are told that it is a 13-week rotation for cleaning. It's the same waste. That's the other sediment, the sediment in addition to the soil particles or that's coming from pastoral farming. And I think we've got a long way to go. We've got some sort-outs and some frankness to be had with parts of our own organisation. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Which we'll pick up in a whole bunch of other places. Now, I'm just aware I did promise that we would break for lunch at 12:30. It's now 12:40, and we need to finish by 3. The Mayor has a meeting starting at 3 or close to. So, Councillor Filipaini, you've indicated you don't need to...
No, because I stand between us and lunch, so I don't want to do that.
Okay. Councillor Lee, people are speaking in agreement. Is there any other point that hasn't already been made you might wish to make?
I just want to endorse the comments by Councillor Darby. This is a problem we have been aware of for quite some time. It's not like a new problem, but we're in a cleft stick because our policy and those of successive governments has been to encourage growth. But our resources in dealing with the results and the environmental effects of growth are inadequate. And Councillor Darby is quite correct just by focusing on one tiny part of the problem, cesspits in the inner city, which are a low-tech and very old-style way of dealing with sediment, which work very well if they are maintained, but they are not. So, Madam Chair, I would just add one thing to the discussion. Rather than a strategic approach to sediment, how about a serious approach to controlling sediment? Because what does a strategic approach to sediment really mean? We've had that for years. We want some action. We need to get serious about this because we're drowning in silt and we are not complying with Section 5 of the Resource Management Act. Again, never mentioned. The Vacuous Auckland Plan seems to get a mention about safeguarding the life support capacity of ecosystems, water, soil and the marine environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is an action plan, and I commend our staff for coming up with how to deal to this finally, and I commend the members who've supported that. I'm going to put the recommendation. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. We'll stand